Oh, okay. Perfect.
Nice.
Right on time. So I will, because we have, yes, because we have more people that just joined. I'll just go through the rules very quickly. Obviously, this is our first ever book club, so I'm quite excited about this. To make it easy for everyone, when we're not speaking, let's try to keep our microphones on mute if it's possible. I don't want everyone to feel like they're forced to talk. So if you don't feel like you have anything to add, or you feel a bit shy about talking, just don't feel discouraged if you just want to listen. And of course, I spoke before, this is not a lecture, it's a conversation, and I want everyone to feel very comfortable to espouse their ideas and their visions of the book. And Stable will be recording for posterity, so we can have this for the members that weren't able to be here. And of course, if you want to leave in the middle of the conversation, don't feel like you're forced to stay either. And let's be very open-minded and respectful of everyone. Everyone has a different perspective, of course, of the book, and I think that's what's going to make this conversation so rich. Let's start. So, I asked very quickly for everyone that was here before if this was their first ever Dostoevsky, and many of you said yes. Um, what was your first impression of the author then?
Can I start? So for
Yeah,
me,
of course.
I think that, of course, the name of Dostoevsky was a very prominent name that I heard when just like anyone just talked
Mm.
about the heights of literature, and like even when I haven't read Dostoevsky, I have seen, you know, films of many adaptations of like Crime and Punishment or The Idiot, or taking elements of his novels or just his style. So I always had some familiarity with him for years, but now having actually read an actual novel, I think I said it prior, but I think it's a perfect introduction for me because my perception of Dostoevsky was something where I went into it thinking of just this basic idea of he's an author that spouts and thinks and presents to the reader of these philosophical ideas, which is interesting when it comes to Notes of the Underground. Why I found it so enlightening and refreshing because, in an almost poignant way, it's a novel about examining, more so examining than criticizing, this this idea and this notion of people that do intellectualize a lot, really. In many ways, it's a novel. It's a novel of notes about someone that has this intellectual book about a man who intellectualizes a lot. And I found that the way it examines that, especially just of a character, because it absolutely is of a character that we're seeing through, that Dostoevsky has written. He has written a specific character with traits that has a very, like, he has a very interesting perspective, yet and I do find it fascinating how he makes good points, but yet when we learn more about him, you can see that even though he does have valid critiques and he does have insights to some degree of people that I find interesting, he ultimately is a character that has his own insecurities, and ultimately that's what made me really appreciate it, was this this humbleness of knowing that this isn't just a novel with intellectual ideas, or more of an emotional core that speaks a lot about just humanity, I think, and how deep down I think we all can be very incredibly critical while still being people that have our own like flaws within society.
I also had this perception that Dostoevsky is, in a way, almost talking about the shadow of an intellectual man, a man that perhaps thinks too much before he acts, or internalizes and overthinks a lot, right? Obviously, he is dealing also with the idea of the rationality and the nihilism that was situating Russian youth at the time, right? Like this book appears right after What Is to Be Done, and by Chernyshevsky, which was, a book that was really influential to Lenin in the future as well. And it really applied this idea of complete materialism and looking at the world through a lens that was not anymore transcendental, but it was, I suppose, strongly in the head, it's strongly inside your own mind, almost like you could perhaps rationalize your way into everything in life. And I think that's why the book works really well between the two parts, because you have the internal world of the character in the underground, and then he explodes to action, and he's not really able to put his theories into practice, right? He's not able to justify his actions in the real world. And I think that's what makes the story so strong. Like in such a short period of time, basically, like how many days really the book is structured around, right? It's one giant action, because a lot of the first part happens inside the character's mind. And even the second part, I think, he also is in a way, not in the sense of like a dream, but in a sense of all we see is his perception, right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that, about how it was interesting because, especially since I knew nothing about the book, so when the first part ended, I was already very captivated. But once it went into a more of a grounded state of a world that Dostoevsky shows us, like it still feels a bit like there are parts that I find it to be a bit metaphysical in the way that it describes its reality. Yet I think
Mm.
it's a it's a great contrast between the two parts about how we have these intellectual ideas, we have this view of the world that is constantly in this mind where you still get a detailed description about just the world that this character is living in. And once that character actually applies that to a reality that he lives in, it's shown like to be this like it's very much almost it's an act of futility where everything that he does, like ultimately, it just like no matter how much he tries, it stretches out his like his teachings to like to his own self, like constantly saying about these ideas. When he presents them to everyone else, it just only just it kind of loops around back to him. It's only just presenting more of his own insecurities and his own. I think he does have a sense of self-loathing about himself, especially when we learn about like his true feelings near the very end, which
Yeah.
like it was a unique kind of catharsis about just someone that I think is just finally just opening up. In some ways, like some people can see him as just fully admitting that he's pathetic, but I do find that there's a strength in how he is completely actually willing to be vulnerable by the end, like how he's actually allowing himself to break down and to just like say that like he's just a scoundrel that he hate like he always wanted to be a good person, but yet for some reason I think it was like yeah, you can argue he never was a quote unquote good person because he never allowed himself to be that. Because if you're always thinking about a very critical mindset, it can only be you can only be in a world that is nihilistic. You can only be in a world that you're constantly criticizing, and this idea that you have no respect for anyone. Like if really like yeah, there's many validity in being critical, but if you're dwelling in that reality, I think then you never allow yourself to actually be sincere.
Yeah, I feel that as well about the book. I There's one part that we were quoting in the house the other day in which he says like the reason I know, I mean, I'm paraphrasing it completely, but he says the reason I know I'm an intellectual is because I never finish anything. And that is such a punch, because the idea of overthinking things and like the idea of like sometimes starting something and then almost keeping yourself in a loop of thought, and perhaps even like thinking yourself out of the things you want to do, right? It's so scary because in a sense, I mean, the underground man is this pitiful, extreme, radical character, but I do think that anyone that tends to overthink a little bit can see themselves a little bit, even a minutia in that character, in that phrase, and is a big trap in a. That's why I
Yeah,
say like I think a little bit of that. Go on.
I was gonna say I really identified with that line too, where he says that he's not. He like justifies him being intellectual and by him not finishing things. I mean, like I think as a creative person, I sometimes you could get in that trap. Oh, it's just because it needs to be perfect that I'm doing things like I'm trying to get it right. You know what I mean? So it's not finished yet, stuff like that. But in reality, it just kind of just can't justify it like that. You just gotta like buckle down, like do it. Like I see that like a lot throughout the book, how he's just kind of like you guys said earlier, over intellectualize things away. You know what I mean, kind of justify his inadequacies and stuff like
Mhm.
that. What was it called? And it was interesting about the first part. The first time, this is the first time I, I read Dostoevsky. I did like listen months ago to his first book. Was it Folk? Uh, like the audiobook of it, but a lot of that didn't. Audiobooks usually don't like stick with me after I listen to them, so I don't really count it. But what's interesting when I was reading the first part, I was because I'm rereading it for this. This is actually the second time I read it. I noticed one of the notes I left at the end of the first part was that it seems like the first part is like a sort of a manifesto he's laying out, and we're probably going to see it put into action in the second part. That's so. Would you guys agree that that's what it seems like the first part of the book is? Him trying to like lay out a foundation of like the way he thinks, the world works, and stuff like that for his mind.
What do you guys think? I just want to do a little addendum really quick because Louis is a bit sick, but he's right here next to me and he decided that he wants to join.
I'm here, everyone. Everyone.
Can you guys hear?
Yeah, I can
Yes,
hear
he's
him.
Yeah.
Hi,
joining.
Lewis.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Lewis.
Yeah, I heard that this was going on, and I wanted to be professional and come and join because I didn't feel like I was going to be my 100% self. But I heard the conversation a little bit, so I wanted to join.
Yeah.
I'll add a thing here and there when I can.
Yeah, but I also think that it ultimately, Brian, I also think he lays a foundation for his ideas.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily say almost a manifesto, but I can see totally that perspective that you're coming from. I can see that as well because so many times in the first part he almost underlines over the underliner what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
And did you guys notice as well that he loses himself in his own speech in the sense of like he will start here in telling the story of the general and he will go to a completely different place that he's unable to finish any thought because his mind is so polluted with his resentment, right?
Yeah,
Yes, I noticed that.
Yeah.
yeah, just in
I
general.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like. Sorry.
Oh, Rob. No, go.
Should I go? Yeah, it was just about the thing about being like not finishing anything. I do feel like that's it's so sort of the foundation of fear in that. Fear of what actually will happen to him. What will he feel if he does actually complete something, and what will that mean to him to potentially feel nothing because he's so wound up and so resentful and so angry and bitter that he wouldn't be able to feel it. So he doesn't want to be faced with that in a way. I think if potentially if he finishes something, and on the back of what Wally was saying at the beginning about, I mean, my preconception was that the part one was set in prison, probably because I thought Dostoevsky wrote it while he was in prison or something like that. So by the time I got to part two, I was sort of quite geared up to think, oh, what's he done? What terrible thing? But when it's just quite pitiful and empty, and it's not really based on anything except his just unpleasant, angry behavior. That
Yeah.
made me feel more pitiful for him, and just like it was dark as well because it's so I can relate to this person a lot. I'm maybe
Yeah.
not meant to a lot, but I do. Yeah, I could have imagined my life being this had I not made other choices. So.
I also felt like that when I was reading the book. Again, as I said, like is a reread for me older now, and it's like, wow, this really is like completely the shadow of someone creative, of someone that can rationalize or overthink too much. And this is like even in a surface level reading. I mean, there's so much of the character that because he despises the world that, I mean, he doesn't hide that in the beginning. Like the first line is, "I am a sick man. I'm a spiteful man." Like that's he's very
Yeah,
upfront about what he
I
is
love
and what he
that.
become, right? Yeah.
I think that going to what Brian was saying about the structure, and even Brad as well, and it's always interesting because like we've communicated with a lot of people here, but sometimes I've seen them like hearing them for the
It's
first
different,
time,
yeah.
so it's different. But it's nice to hear some voices for the first time as well. But I always thought as well that when you read through it, I think that the structure of the book is a complete fallacy because it's as though the book is in two parts somewhat. The first half is almost like a manifesto. It's almost like the complete dissection of his thoughts. But ultimately, what the book also is, it's primarily structured within part two, apropos of Wet Snow, where he begins telling a story that's unrelated to the dinner, and he seems to get so distracted by that. And the first part just seems to fall to the wayside. And I believe that because the first part, Underground, is him trying to create a structure, or I mean almost a mathematical approach. You see at the amount of times that he refers to, tune to his thought on the laws of nature and how the correct way that man should live is by this exacting mathematical approach. And so he tries to actually apply that, but the thing is that he himself is a complete contradiction. He doesn't stand by anything. He doesn't mean anything that he says, and at the same time, he'll mean the exact opposite. There's no end goal with him. And when it comes to the structure of the first part, it seems so pointless by the time the material world sets in, that you have this swelling internal world of him, and he means it so much, and it's so deep within him. But by the time he's actually able to apply it, it becomes so meaningless. It becomes so fleeting, and I think that this is part of his the nature of his duality, because part of Dostoevsky is within his work, what we often see are people that are somewhat archetypes, and they kind of duel with one another. But the primary thing in his work is the internal duel that occurs within people. The only difference with Notes from the Underground is that we see that from the narrator's perspective. We hear everything from his perspective, but he's incredibly unreliable. And so it's as though that he has this constant he's in this constant state of flux where he's attempting to force a structure within his life, but at the same time is constantly fighting against that structure so that he can live, quote, free and against the laws of nature. And what ends up happening is that there's this dissonance, there's this chaos that even works within the structure of the novel itself. I don't know if anyone else felt that when they were seeing, what is this story really about?
And I suppose it's also this cyclical nature of his mind also reflects in the idea that even in the first note that Dostoevsky adds to the beginning bit in the first page, you have this idea that this is a fragment of a diary that was lost or something that was, I mean, we don't really know the beginning and the end, right? Because even Steban was saying that before, the way that the book ends is almost in this catharsis, this speech that you could easily loop to the beginning again, and you can easily have this like cyclical thing in which he almost experiments into going out of the underground. I thought it was interesting that Brad said that he felt it was written in a prison because, in a way, it is a prison, a
Mhm.
prison of his own creation, right? His own mind, which is, I mean, for me, this is like quite clear. What did you
Yeah.
guys think? Go on, Brad.
No, I was just agreeing.
Oh. And I think it really reflects on this 19th century idea of enlightenment and free will and the man becoming a rational man and materialistic in nature and denying everything that is not that. And I mean, I find it very impossible to divorce Dostoevsky's work with also his being an Orthodox Christian, and I can always see that deep down he's trying to alert everyone about the pitfalls of materialism, of becoming extremely tied to the material world, to the point that even though the underground man, I suppose, reject, I mean, he doesn't, he's a retired man, he rejects any work so that he lives in the bare minimum, I suppose. He still thinks of the world in extreme matter, in extreme far. There's nothing beyond, to the point that even when a female character is introduced, almost in an attempt to redeem him of his own rationality and his own craziness in his own head, he rejects her, right? Only after projecting many, many, many things into her. I find that very interesting because she comes in a very important part of the story. So what did you guys thought about Lisa and
Yeah,
her
I
presence in
literally,
the story?
I literally was about to wanting to try and ask that question myself, because that was when I absolutely just fell head over heels for the whole story in general. Because chapter six,
Mm,
when she's introduced, it's, to me, I find it, it's the one chapter that does have, feel like it has a metaphysical reality, especially like during halfway through the conversation, when what they're still in the room, it's just them two, like just basically just staring at each other, these two
mhm,
very these very like abstract characters. And once, I loved the description about how once a candlelight goes out, the room just becomes this this like out of time world that like they're just like, it's
mhm,
like their own purgatory. They're just trapped there, and they're very much are just, they just have to have like a conversation one on one between each other. And I find that with Lisa is someone that I think represents like the underground, this character's like sense of honesty, of how this is a character that is the one that truly challenges him and makes him having to actually think about himself in a way where, like, because she herself is someone that has this, like, she's described in certain instances as, like, I do think like the way the underground calls her a creature, I think is interesting, because in a way, like, yeah, she is like an archetype, like she's an archetype of this, like, a beautiful girl, but yet this this kind of an oddity, where she she seems like the perfect, like person to for him, like at the beginning, when he sees how, like, he already has these dreams, he already presents this irrationality that is truly like of some affection, like thinking that I found someone that I can actually care about. But it kind of loops around and back to just like she's just become someone that he is just so anxious of, because she constantly has to speak about stuff that he is very insecure about. And that's why, like, after they meet up, and like he gives her his address, like, which is another
no.
thing that I found so like hilarious about, bringing it back to how all he does is just completely just loops it all around back at him again. Like, he creates his own problems, like. And I myself, like, the way it was written about how he was so anxious about, like, if Lisa will ever come back, and like we'll just see who he truly is, trying to put on this idea that he is confident, which is like throughout the whole book, like he says stuff that shows courage, but ultimately, once he actually has to confront that, I think Lisa is the character that truly brings that out of him. It shows his vulnerability that he's been like hiding away. And I think that's from Lisa being someone that I think shows a lot of courage in the way that she is just fully open. I think everything that she says, especially, like, I love how, like, he asked her about marriage, and she just simply thinks
Mm,
about that, and she just, like, there are some marriages that aren't that happy. Like she's like, what, 20, and she sounds like she has a lot of experience in a way that I think, like, like the underground character doesn't, he kind of lacks. and that is a
Yeah.
challenge to him, especially in the way that she's confidently someone that is just able to be so expressive. Like, it was so unnerving, that one passage where it's described as her having this very uneasy smile, almost like something you see like in a horror film, of just her. I could just imagine like
Yeah.
visually her slowly moving her head to look at him, and she's just has this kind of twitching smile, like almost like she's about to like hurl at him, which she kind of does, but in a compassionate way near the end. I think that's something very
Yeah.
interesting about it, is that ultimately,
It is
like every
interesting. Go on.
like I'm just gonna conclude by saying, like, once again, I think it is a sense where everything that he does, like thinking that he's gonna project all these ideas onto other people, it just loops around back to him and reveals more about himself more than anything.
Yeah, I think as well, the smile, I also perhaps is almost like a fantasy of his own imagination, because we can never know with the underground man what really is the truth of what's happening, because everything feels so much ingrained to his own perception of the world, everything that is inside his mind and the way he sees it from a very particular perspective, and it's impossible to know exactly if her smile was indeed terrifying or not, right? I like to imagine that it wasn't terrifying at all. It was all in his mind. And I
Like,
think
yeah,
is
I think
you talk
I
yeah.
think even he imagined it himself, because the descriptions of the smile go from something that is uneasy to when, before they leave, she comes back to him like quickly, and I think it's described as something that is full of like compassion and just love. Like, it's just like it's like a cute smile by the end. Like, he himself, I think, acknowledges that.
I think I find
And
Lisa the most important in the story for the way that she's quite a contrast to the main character, because she's actually living a life. She actually has suffering slash problems slash like emotions and love and stuff like that, which are real, versus the character who has all of this in his head. And when he confronts it, and he realizes, okay, there's a big difference between living a life and living in your head. I think that's where the character shines for me, or like in the story, and the importance of the character.
Yeah, I think
And,
what
and,
helps
and about marriage? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say what helps supports Jay's point in that is that, well, his confrontation with the officer in the first half of the second
Yeah.
part, whatever, is how he's built it up in his head to this big thing. Like, I'm gonna push this guy. I'm gonna walk into him and stuff like that. And when he finally does, it's so like anticlimactic. Like the officer really even notices him. You know what I mean? So it's
I
just
think
a
that is like I think that that's probably the easiest way to envision who the underground man actually is in that particular story, because I like the idea that, with the dinner scene, Louisa and I were talking about it, and I'd just like to imagine that if we could hear the internal monologues of all of his other friends at the party, they would all be probably saying the exact same thing that the narrator is saying about all of one another.
Yeah.
We're just confined to his perspective. But I love the story about the officer because, as you said, it's so built up. It's as though it's like his life has just coalesced to this one point that he has to bump into this man, and he's planned everything around it and create this entire narrative to the point that as he tries to do it, I mean, he's so cowardly. But what continues is that he still reminisces over this story. He still thinks about it, and the officer thinks nothing of it. But even then, the narrator, he envisions in the future that he is thinking about it, that he will encounter him again, and it's just something that he can't leave behind. And I think the idea of the main character being so in his head in this fantasy world, essentially, I think it's most summarized in that little story. I'd just like to ask everyone as well, just a very simple question. I mean, I suppose it's two questions. Do you like the narrator, and do you think anything is redeemable about him? Just anyone feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I think I do. He's got so much potential. I think Esteban said about courage, and I feel like he's got a lot of insight. He just has nowhere to put it. And I think he's got a lot of heart, but it's completely lost under pain.
Mm.
And losing his family and being an orphan and things like that. So yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily redeemable anymore. Potentially, I
Yeah.
think it might, but only through connection and just trying to let go of it. And I think ingratitude came up a lot, but if he was just to try and work through some gratitude about just small things and connection with people, I think he could change and get out of it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Brad
I
said
think
it
I went
best.
through the journey.
Like, yeah, can I go? Like,
Yeah.
You can go,
okay.
Stephen and
Like, yeah,
Benji.
I think Brad said it best. Like, yeah, I think this underground character. I think a word that is like good to describe him is having potential. Like, he has potential because he clearly is able to speak his mind in a a well-rounded way. It's like everyone has a gift. You just have to learn how to use it wisely. I think. I think that's what I
Yeah.
take away from that.
Yeah.
I want to
you were
say,
gonna Oh, sorry. Go on, Ryan.
I was gonna say, I don't know if I like him, but fortunately, I feel like I identify with some of the things he says, and his thought process says I could see how he gets to him. But like Luiza was saying, it's like it's ultimately he's entrapping himself. He puts himself in his own prison in his mind, and I think if you're not careful, you could like fall into those same traps, like by over intellectualizing and stuff like that.
Yes,
Jay,
somehow
you
he's been able to convince himself that he needs to seek out conflict in his life. And kind of half the book, he's like looking to get his ass kicked
Yeah.
kind of the entire time, which is like, no, I do not like the underground man. I cannot stand him. This is my like second or third time reading it, and he's so annoying to listen to because first you got to listen to his whole internal monologue, and then you got to listen to him get himself into situations where where he wants to get his ass beaten, but it never quite formulates. And weirdly enough, he's going to the spot where he meets Lisa to do that very thing, but he suddenly forgets about it once he sees Lisa seemingly. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really like the character, but I do identify with them. I do identify with being so far kind of in your own head. But, I also think that, there with this type of character, I do think that he might be being a bit too soft on himself and not being completely honest with himself with kind of and he might have potential, but I don't know if he'll ever change or if every time he goes out into the world, he keeps wanting to think that he's been done an injustice and needs
Yeah.
to somehow react, at least violently. Like he's the man who fantasizes about being thrown out of bars, because he sees somebody else thrown out of a bar and he's like, oh, that's the thing for me, you
Do you,
know.
do you think it's like one of those things where it's like he doesn't feel anything, but like pain is the only thing he wants to feel something, type of deal? Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
possibly, yeah.
No, I think he actually wants to gain attention, and I think his whole concept of so his worldview he constructed in his head is basically just to rationalize his not getting any attention by other people, and I think when Lisa finally enters, she is the first person that his intellectuality has power over her, and he uses that power to somehow punishes her by not giving her enough attention initially and pointing out potential flaws in her life. But then he later on realized that there are I think some similarities between his life and her life, and that I think Lisa in a sense is a like his ideal where he would like to maybe what he might strive for in his own life. Yeah.
I think what Brian said is in Tom as well. I do think that he fantasizes about having his ass kicked essentially, because I think in a way he wants to be put in that position of total reality, and there's nothing more real than violence, right? Nothing more real than being beaten by someone. And I think even though he is completely within that frame of mind in his own head, I still think there's humanity with inside of him that wants to feel what it is to be in the real world, not in the underground. I don't also believe that the character is absolutely redeemable, because in a way I think he's presented with the potential of redemption through the character of Luiza, and he chooses not to engage in that redemption. I think he's already been given that possibility of changing his life in a way through that encounter, which was Esteban was saying, which I totally agree, which is someone that is completely sincere, someone that went through things in life that are not just in her head, right? And I think he that's why that interaction between them is so important in the story and so cathartic, I suppose.
Yeah.
What do you think about violence?
Do you wanna say anything, Luiza? Or
No, go on. You can say sorry.
okay, about liking, quote unquote, liking the underground man. I think liking is a bit of a strong word. It's more like I can see a lot of things about him that are good, but what I see the most are things that are not just bad things, not just like being resentful and all of that, but seeing those things reflected back at me. And that's what I reading this book came like. If I read this book like just like a few months ago, some stuff that's going through my life right now, like that would be like that might have been painful to me, because like this book made me realize that being like self-flagellation and self-commiseration are actually both sides of a same coin. And that was kind of a mind-blowing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But I think like
You know where one of the elements, one of the elements that I think reflects back to this conversation also is in the first half of the book. I don't know if you remember, but there's constant imagery that he uses of the body also, where he talks that he thinks that there's something wrong with his liver. He talks about headaches and whatnot.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's yeah, and it seems as though that he has this strive also to physically feel something. It's like what Tom says, he's going around wanting to get his ass kicked. It's a bit like, the Fight Club syndrome of he just wants to feel the most visceral thing. But then he decides to rationalize that in his head, where he starts talking about the toothache and says, only an intelligent man groans from a toothache. And the reason that he does it is a groan of pleasure. And the pleasure comes from the idea of it's a completely irrational act to groan, because you're not doing it to anyone. But what you're doing is you're getting the pleasure from calling out the universe, from calling out the laws of nature that someone would do this to you. But you're going to get a pleasure from that, from being completely irrational. And in this weird, twisted way, his logic, which makes sense, is to live through a contradiction, through an inconsistency.
Yeah, that part of the teaching really got me as well. I think in a way, I suppose that I think why the book it connects so much to us now is because even though Dostoevsky's talking about the 19th century, I was saying to you as well before, was that this is the one book that I'm okay into labeling that is way ahead of its time, in the sense of like he's speaking about things that we now in the contemporary society feel very strongly, right? Like the crisis of meaning, the resentment in the culture. I do think that is almost like he's predicting post-modernity, which is wild, I think. Do you know what I mean? Like in a way, he is the idea of thinking with inside thinking and post-truth. I hate using that term, but the idea of that, right?
I
How
even
he
found it
self-
really funny when he mentioned about like I have to be satisfied with model flats, and I assume like flats is buildings just like now, and it just reminded me of Manchester.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
is he
but-
predicting or has nothing changed? Like if we go back to the whatever century and we killed the god and we didn't find anything else to do. Like we tried to find capitalism structures of consuming and stuff like that, and it didn't help. And then there's nothing else came. So since 19th century, nothing changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that because it's all like the timing of it. It's the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and I was said to Luiza, it's like this. It was the moment that truth and value became this apocryphal thing because anything could be created at any point, and so human value in and of itself is just a structure that you can manifest how and whenever you please.
Yeah. And even
And
in the go on.
In the books, he also talks a bit about technology and the progress, and he also touches a bit. I'm not sure. I don't remember what his stance on it, but I think it's quite similar. So it's not clear that technology is going to help us. And he also touches on the Crystal Palace, or whatever it's called in English. And he talks about, okay, we're going to build this beautiful, rational future, and it's going to be wonderful. And then you cannot do anything bad, and it's going to be super rational. And it's quite. And we didn't get past it that much. We're still in the half rational, half everything's going to be rationalized world. So yeah, nothing much changed.
Yeah, but I'm thinking right now because like right now I think this discussion has made me realize is that ultimately what I see within this character is that I think I don't like the character as much as I like his ideas, which ultimately those ideas, as we said, is not something exclusive to him. They could just be probably like every character that we don't hear the subconscious probably thinking the exact same things right now, or at least a different version of the same words. Because I think there was one sentence like near the beginning of part 2 that really struck a nerve with me like personally. But I think it's not because of the character, but just because of the idea. I think this is something evident. I put a bookmark onto this. I'm gonna read from my copy, where is it? Like where he talks about this idea of respectable people, a respectable man, and he ultimately comes to this conclusion where every respectable man of our times is bound to be a coward and a slave. Or what I take away from that, you're either a coward or a slave in this idea of being respectable. Because I remember when I was reading part 1, when I didn't really know anything about this character, I was reading it a bit as you could argue that there's somewhat of a class commentary within part 1, especially if you don't know much about this character, because he is commenting a lot about what essentially is many things that is in this bourgeois society of respectability, or of just this over materialist type of mentality that is clearly something that he is taking notice of and is criticizing, and of course of this idea of ignoring people. Because what's funny, I think, like in the part 1, when I was going in blind, I would have probably I was kind of assuming at some points this was a character in the fringes of society, especially of like him talking about toothache and about people that are just looking down at him. But of course, with part 2, I think it is more compelling that ultimately he's an ordinary man. I think I think it would even be he would have been exceptional if he was in the fringes, if anything. Like if he was to be exceptional, it would have been someone that had to actually deal with so much heartache and so much pain, like so many people in the lower class have to do ultimately. But why I find that line of this idea of respectable people ultimately being cowards or slaves is that this is something I think that I have seen a lot in people that I know personally. And I think that's the ultimate thing that I resonate with, is that of this, I am just, especially because it's with friends and even family of like if anything, like I'm thinking, I don't think they can never be malicious. In fact, they're the quite opposite. I think many respectable people, they are quite naive. That's why they allow themselves to do things that I find very odd and cringeworthy, like to just put it bluntly. And because especially in this world of modernity, of being in this materialist world, this like it is something where I I have criticisms a lot with that, and I could, even when I just look on the streets, it's like it's like kind of relate. I kind of had the same type of monologue as this, or what Daniel Plainview says about how, like, when I look at people, I see nothing worth liking. I ultimately, like, I've grown to have that so much, and it's so easy to dwell on that. But I know that this is why I like when I experience a story like this, because it reminds me that being a pessimist, for me, it is a slave mentality as much as it is being a naive person. Like, I can criticize and complain about people that I know that have become models or entrepreneurs or just go do brand deals and stuff like that. I've talked about this a couple times in the past, but ultimately, like, I criticize that, but at worst, I could do the same thing, or even just at best, I could be someone that just ultimately, I'm just like, because I think in the last time you were here, Lewis, you mentioned how we try to philosophize things, and ultimately, like us philosophical artistic types, we're ultimately so useless, because all we do is just stand around within our minds, like, and ultimately, like, it's so easy where we spend too much time trying to figure out the things that ultimately, when you could just say it in one sentence, like, you know what, yeah, I probably just don't like it, or even just objectively, yeah, it's probably not that good. And I think why it's something very important is that, again, it's easy to dwell on this pessimism that I think can really absorb someone, and think that ultimately, like, you gain nothing out of cynicism. Like, I think we talked about this a lot.
I think that I think that the common thread that seems to occur with people reading Dostoevsky a lot, but particularly reading this, like a lot of people have said it here, whether they like or don't like, one thing that people have is that they identify somewhat with the character. It seems to be the universal thing of, you know, as though that like this is a warning from Dostoevsky to a certain ilk of society of what you can become, or at the very least, a fraction of you has already become. And it, I don't know where I stand on that, because I obviously recognize the Underground Man. I mean, whatever you want to call him, I like the name the Underground Man. I think it sounds good. But whatever you think of him, uh, he is someone that I think, I mean, at least everyone in here probably inhabits to some degree, and it's the one thing that I know that I also try to monitor within myself, because it is very easy to just be constantly be looking outwards with cynicism. And it's like the stories that he tells himself, while reality is just occurring in real time right in front of him, he is crafting this entire fantasy world of reason and his own logic, and his position in a hierarchy where none of it exists. And I find it very applicable. It was a conversation that we had recently where we were trying. It came to like a conversation about Taylor Swift and all things like that, of like, what does it mean? And the reality is that while normal people are just living their life, and even to a certain degree creating things and being productive, however you want to view that, they are still doing things. Whereas the quote intellectual, the higher being is sat marinating. I mean, literally here, he's marinating underground, and he chooses to be underground because he looks at the world. And it's not that he's wrong. It's that the world just doesn't understand him at all. He couldn't possibly be wrong. I also just wanted to, because I noticed earlier, Tyler, I think you were also trying to mention something in the conversation. So if you wanted to say what you wanted to say earlier, by all means, unless I've just put you on the spot, in which case I apologize.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, when we were talking about, like, how we view the character and like whether or not the underground man is kind of like redeemable. The thing that I was like the very first one of the first things I wrote down in my notes, like when I like got into the introduction in part one, was I wrote down that he is a living contradiction, and that he's like he's self appreciating, but he's also self deprecating. He's claims that he's telling all these truths and like expounding upon all these truths that he knows, but he also calls himself a liar and like tells the audience that he's lying about certain like things that don't matter. Um, and he tries to paint himself in like a positive light, but it also is a negative light. And I think also with that too is so he also understands the contradictions that the world has, and he's trying to rationalize like himself and like try to explain contradictions that he sees in the world itself, but also himself having contradiction within how he lives his life and how he pretty much is um, not able to live authentically. Like he's not able to live in a way that like affirms his own ideas. Like he just seems like he's in a constant state of flux of like trying to live authentically but knowing that he can't, and wanting to change but he constantly says over and over that he can't change, and ultimately that throws him into a state of inner turmoil and basically causes him to be depressed, to be angry, to be spiteful, to want to go descend into the underground and like go in his corner and not come out and like not want to interact with the world. And I think that alienation too is something that I strongly resonated with, especially like earlier on in my life, where I would just everybody. I think everybody at some point in time, if you're if you ever go through like seasons of like depression and things like that, or just where you become cynical at the state of the world and like you just come to a point where you just don't know like how to truthfully and authentically live in the world. I think you just
Yeah.
eventually come to a point where you're just like, I despise this world. Like, I don't want to be here. I don't like if I had the choice, I would just, I would go underground. I would be like the underground man and basically shut myself away and just, you know, all that sort of stuff. So I very much resonate with that. But at the same time, I think the redeemable part about him is that he understands like what he needs to do, and like
Mm.
he has the solution to the contradictions that he sees in the world. Like he rightfully, in my lens, that is he very much understands like the logical inconsistencies and the philosophical shortcomings that materialism and the modern age, like the spirit of the modern age that's emerging at the time. He understands, the contradictions and just the shortcomings of that, and he has the answers, but
Mhm.
he constantly just gets in his own way, and he doesn't take those ideas for himself, and he doesn't try to apply the ideas to himself to live a better life. He just doesn't do that, and he doesn't think that he's capable because he says over and over that he can't change. He can't not be sick. He can't not be spiteful. He can't not be a liar. And also he also says over and over how he hates his life, but he constantly says over and over that he can't change his conditions. And I
Yeah.
think I think we oftentimes fall into that, like especially in my own life when I've fallen into deep seasons of like depression and like whatever. It's just like, man, I wish my world or my life would change, but I know I can't do anything, so I'm just gonna wallow and I'm just gonna descend
Yeah.
further and further down into just depression and um, and negative feelings and like just being in a horrible headspace all the time.
Yeah.
But um, yeah, he has the answers. He just won't. He just can't get out of his own way, nor does he want to. I think at the heart of it. So he has the potential, like you guys have been saying, like he has the potential to do that, but he just won't do it. And so I don't think that he'll allow himself to be redeemable in that way.
Yeah,
I feel like
think
he's like found.
we all talk at the same time. Go on,
Sorry.
Bryan first.
I was just gonna say, it feels like he has found a comfort in his like misery, like going back to
Yeah.
the tooth thing. You know what I mean? He's like he's enduring the pain and finds like some catharsis in like the moans and stuff like that, and then he's just like so comfortable in his misery that he's like maybe afraid to change or something like that. He doesn't know how else to act within the world. Like, how old is he? He's like older, but does it ever say exactly how old he is?
He says like at
But
least
he's
like
like
at the point of part 2, he says like he's like 24 years old.
he is.
No,
He
he's
says
like
to-
40, I think.
I
Oh,
thought he was
he's
older.
40, yeah.
around
Because he
40.
recalls a memory in part 2 about how he was 24, but he's
Yeah.
in part 1 he's 40.
Yeah, and then he hates the idea that anyone would live past 60, but he knows that he will live past 60. He'll live till 80.
Yeah.
It's like he's already crafted his entire life narrative and how it's going to
Misery.
inevitably fail no matter what.
Yeah, I find it interesting that he keeps fluctuating between feeling grandiosity and like inflating his own ego in the text, and then complete self-loathing. And he goes between these hyper rational spaces of mind, hyper analytical, but then he says, "But I'm a dreamer. I am a dreamer." And then he goes on these tangents about literature and how that dinner party is going to be horrible because it's not going to be literary enough. And that feels so close to home as well in a way
Oh, and Luiza.
of like feeling this disconnect and discontent, you know, with people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I could never see myself as as the underground man, because I felt at some point I got the call of the redemption. Like I accepted the redemption arc, you know, in my life, I suppose. And I can see that clearly in him. And I totally agree with Tyler that he essentially already is setting himself to be a sick man. I mean, that's the first phrase of the book. That's what he starts with, and that's what he ends with. That's who he is. He set himself to be that.
Yeah, but
Do you guys go on, Steven?
Like you just reminded me, like one line that Lisa says, like near the end of chapter 6 that I love, like of how, like she describes what he's saying. It sounds like just in books, or later, like he describes himself as bookly, or at least my translation says like it's a very bookly look at observing the world, and maybe even he's probably even looking at like let alone like fiction, but like even just nonfiction. I think you're taking ideas from other people, which ultimately is what like knowledge is, which is something that I take a lot from like the novel in terms of him being trying to be an intellectual, is this idea of knowledge, because knowledge, I think, is a unique like attribute of the human mind, of how ultimately we're taking ideas from other people, and very rarely do you ever have those individuals that create ideas that shape an entire society, let alone the entire world. And I think it's so easy, like, because I said before about how, like, I think Brad said it best, where the thing about the underground is that he shows potential, and I think because of that knowledge that he has gained, he clearly has some sort of knowledge that he has gained about the world, probably either due to just a spite, or because of actual passion for like some part of him that believes in what he is saying. But ultimately, with the knowledge that he has, like it is something where it's a gift, but you have to use it wisely. And I think if you don't use it in very meaningful ways, especially in very positive ways, I think, of actually wanting to enlighten yourself, like there's a difference between being enlightened and just using that knowledge to make excuses about everything. And I think the underground more leans towards the latter, but he so could easily be in the former.
I actually underlined that book comment. The first thing I thought of was maybe, is it does she think he's sort of sermonizing? There's something sort of sanitized maybe about what he's saying, disconnected with the real world, which might be her view of, going to church and being sermonized to in a church by a vicar because of how she's young and because of her, position in the world. It did make me wonder, it sounds like a book or the book. Yeah, I like that bit.
I want to add some fire to this. I don't think being intellectual is virtue, and having knowledge is also not a virtue. And now in the world where we have AI and stuff like this that have a lot of knowledge that can summarize the knowledge and do stuff with knowledge, we can see that knowledge is not that good of a thing by itself. And maybe we talk about okay, being a critical thinker is good, but this person from the underground is clearly not. We also talked about that in the first part there are a lot of ideas and interesting ideas, but we don't know if it's his ideas. We don't know if it's just quotes from other people that he doesn't understand. That's why he cannot apply them. So I think it's really important for me in this book is to kind of realize that, okay, if somebody sounds smart, if somebody has knowledge, if somebody can quote you, somebody from whatever philosopher, is a lot of quotes in the book. I'm not sure if you go and see it. It's a lot of Russian quotes and a lot of philosophic quotes, and it's quotes and a bit of interpretation, a bit of contradictions. Anytime he tries to speak or say something by himself, there are contradictions, but when there are quotes and ideas from quotes, they're solid. So I don't think he's that good or smart or somebody to learn from. I don't think he has a potential. I mean, all of us have a potential because we all identify with underground men and everybody has a bit of this. But as he is a person, I don't think we can say he can just change the world, that he can become a hero. I think he's just average, mediocre intellectual.
Yeah, Jay.
I agree with that, to be honest. Yeah, I agree that he doesn't have potential.
I think Jay said something valid, and I think when I was saying it, like knowledge, I guess I was basically just thinking of it knowledge as a bit of a synonym for experience, which maybe I think experience is a more appropriate word, because I think when you have genuine experience in life, you gain the knowledge of that experience that you personally went through, and ultimately people, I think that's what people can have. Anyone, if they choose to actually engage with life and engage with actual meaning that can be found, because absolutely, even just trying to talk with people and having the experience of, okay, how do I disagree with them? What do I agree with them? Do I find humor in what they say? Do I find it repulsive or stuff like that? Which, oh yeah, by the way, I love how he constantly uses the word repulsive to describe things in this book. But yeah, I'm just thinking about how, experience ultimately, and I think that's why, I guess, knowledge is something that I think is arbitrary, because I think most people, when they think of knowledge, they think of just trivia, which I think that's what most people think of as knowledge today, as just spouting out trivia that you can find from the internet, which I'm saying this as someone that used to be like that as a teenager, where I remember vividly where before there was one time where I tried to quote someone on something that Albert Camus say, and this was back when I didn't know any jack shit about Albert Camus, and I was just going off the cuff. And looking back in it, that was just me just basically spouting out trivia that I didn't even understand. And to this day, I still don't have all the answers. I think that's the best thing you can do, is just admit right off the bat that you're not the one that is going to give all the answers. Which ultimately, I think if we were to find all the answers, there would be nothing left in the world to discover. Because which again is another thing which which you can easily be trapped in. But I think we have some definitive answers in life that we can, that's why we have a thing of, that's why we have virtues, that's why there is truth that we can see in our world. But ultimately, I think that when you are someone that I think has simply just has tried to just excuse any sort, like, especially this goes with people that have been like that are very immoral, that they try and we see this a lot with many people of how they try and excuse their actions with an intellectual thought, and so knowledge becomes then this weapon that they use, like this very redundant tool that I think, and that's why ultimately I do agree with what Jay says. Like I'm thinking, yeah, ultimately, I think more experience is more appropriate because we all are able to have experiences that do change us, that do define us, and I think whether or not you take the best parts of that and you are who you are because of your experiences, and that's how people
Mhm.
become very horrid or have some form of wisdom. Like we're not the wisest person in the world, but I think we can we I think if we choose to, if we go down the path of actually maturing, we can become a little bit like a small, even just a small iota of having more and more wisdom in our lives because we allow ourselves to think about them. We allow ourselves to not just take the surface level, even because I think that that is what makes us like very well developed, like intelligent human beings, I would say.
And there's a contradiction in what he's doing about knowledge again when he goes on about twice two makes four, and he says that's an incredible thing, and that's sort of factual knowledge, yeah, that empirical stuff.
Yeah, there's a quote
and it makes you wonder what does he believe about what does, if it makes five, what is that? Is it beauty? Is it love? Is it God? And I guess when he meets Lisa, I've been calling her Liza when I was reading it. Whoops. But when he meets her, he's got so many preconceptions and judgments. That what is that knowledge? Where does his knowledge? He's just trying to use the knowledge in a way to control her, to prove himself right, to prove his preconceptions about her, and to sort of control her and impose himself on her and what he believes is right and true, and and maybe it is, and he's got a lot of insight about how difficult and hard and cruel the world can be, but he becomes that cruelness, and he causes her a lot of pain and harm. So he becomes the thing he thinks he's so above.
Yeah, I love how you
And he's
describe it
really,
as
really superficial as well, by the way.
Yeah.
Is he
Almost
deeply superficial?
sorry?
I mean, he always goes on about how people look and ugliness, and he's lost, for all his intellectualizing, he's really superficial.
Yeah,
That's just really surprising to
I
me.
love how he describes like normal people as stupid. Like in his mind, like to be a normal person, it's to have stupidity, which is another thing where, like the instant I read that sentence, I had a lot of sympathy and agreement with it. But now that after having experience and pondering about that, it is something that I do find like it's almost like a coping mechanism for him of like his own insecurities. And I think with contradiction, I took I wrote down something from chapter 5 in part 1 that I find very like a bit ironic, that like of how like he says something so like outright like what he should do, but yet he doesn't do it, especially when it comes to self-doubt and insecurities. I like to paraphrase from my version of the book. You see, in order to begin to act, one must be completely assured beforehand that there are absolutely no remaining doubts. But how am I, for instance, to reassure myself? Where are the primary that I am to take my stance upon? Where are my bases? Where am I to take them from? It's like he has this like he has this like he has the answer, but like for some reason he never acts upon that.
Yeah. I think that in relation to what Brad was saying as well, I think that he's incredibly superficial because we see this a lot. He wants to be something more than he is and is incapable of putting those things into effect. But so much of what he wants as well is just that surface level thing. he talks about himself having the face of an intellectual, and that's why people judge the way he looks. And it's again creating these logical loopholes between them. But there's also an element where he's talking about the Crystal Palace and almost this utopian thing that he wants. And at the same time, he starts to talk about it of, oh, but why is it that I should want these things? And he begins to recognize his own, sorry, not his own materialism, but his own superficiality that he is threatened by. But then at the same time, because that is just in many ways the genius of this man, he's able to come up with, oh no, but the reason that I want this is actually a virtuous reason. And I think it's probably in the same chapter as well, that as he's explaining the virtues of what he is and his love of the sublime, and that he actually loves their sublime art and he loves the beautiful in the world, then I think that's also at the end of the same chapter where he refuses to pay his servant because he needs to go to a dinner with friends.
Yeah, it's I also think that projection that he does, I mean, Esteban was talking about the idea that he uses the word repulsive a lot. And one of the first things he says about Lisa when he meets her is the idea that she probably noticed something horrible in his face. So he's also putting that projection into her, that the way he sees the world as repulsive, she's also seeing, she should then see him as repulsive. But just to get a bit warm, the conversation, why do you guys feel that he rejects her? Why do you guys feel that he rejects us? Because for me, it's all well and good. He knows what he needs to do. He has perspective into his downfalls, into society and all that. But the hardest bit, which is the call to action, he's unable to do it, right? So it's almost like in a Jungian way, he fails to ever conquer his individuation, his call for the shadow integration, in the sense of like, he can see his own shadow, he can see the shadow of the collective around him, but he's unable to do anything about it. And she is there just looking at him, simply sitting, and she makes him so uncomfortable, right? So why do you guys feel like, why does he reject her?
I feel like and I need to get the thought straight. So I think his constant obsession about appearance and his search for what could be wrong with him in terms of physical things like his liver is failing and so on. He's so obsessed about the outside because he probably feels like he's lacking in the inside, and when at the end he breaks down and cries, I think it's some sort of confirmation for him, for that that his problem is not actually his outside appearance, which he's obsessing about, and where he's trying to look smart to other people, and but it's actually his inside, his mentality and so on, which is his main problem. And I think he's confronted by that, and I think that's it scares him because he doesn't know how to fix it. And so I think that's why he eventually rejects Lisa, because it's just a sort of mirror for him. Yeah.
For me, I think his identity, he feels like his identity is still too tied to just being underground, being alone, completely alone. And that if he transitions to a new life where he can find love and companionship, he will not be himself anymore. And that must have terrified him. That's my interpretation of it.
Maybe perhaps his self only exists in his own mind, because when you put someone in front of you, then essentially you have to be what you think, right? You have to, those two things have to be congruent with each other. They have to make sense. But his life doesn't really make sense with his own thoughts, right? Do you guys feel that maybe I do think that the fact that the character is a female character is also super important to the underground man, in the sense not only in like the female representing the emotional side, or perhaps like something more tender that he doesn't have, right? But also just because of the obvious nature of his attraction to a woman, and him being put in a position in which he cannot escape from his downfalls at all, right? So why? So I still want to hear more about why you guys think that he reject her. Why? Why?
I mean, it's not only that she's a woman, but she's a sex worker as well,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I feel like that has a lot to play into this. He doesn't really touch on it, but due to the, as we've kind of talked about, the kind of the nature of how he writes and how we really can't trust him as a narrator. I mean, do y'all think that like he sleeps with her because he makes mention of being in a bedroom in that
Mm.
scene, and I wouldn't put it past the narrator to lie about something like that, to try to keep that hidden even from his most underneath thoughts, thinking that he's too good for that, you know? And
Yeah.
I think that might be part of his rejection. It's just kind of that he can't here he is lecturing a sex worker when he is, potentially, he's the one that's purchased her and he can't think about himself, so he puts everything onto her.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good point.
He's
I never considered that he hadn't, yeah, performed, and a bit maybe he couldn't because he felt so scrutinized, and because he couldn't read her necessarily. And I guess because when he noticed the money had been left, that was a bit of a blow. It was just so sad. Again, that's just that missed opportunity that he just doesn't understand because he can only see relationships as perfunctory things. He can't just let go and just see something for what it is and just accept something or someone. He has to control, he has to impose, he has to project.
he's also super unreliable, as we were mentioning over and over again. So I is he almost he lets you to believe that she's in his room, and then you remember, of course, she's a sex worker, and then you never know exactly what went down between the two of them. And I think we could never know because we could never trust his real version of the story, right? Um, one of the things that I was thinking, and I even mentioned to Lou as well when we're talking about the book between the two of us, is again, one more time, I really don't like getting older books and bringing to contemporary society that much. But as we said, a lot of things haven't really changed much. But he reminds me a lot, especially with relation to his relation to control and women, his crisis of meaning, his resentment. He reminds me a lot of the culture we have now of mass shootings and mass killers and incels. The idea of they have this grandiose visions of the world that they want to impose, but they themselves fail to even manage their own selves, right? And they try to impose that into the world around them. And it just reminds me so much of it. It's like this post-structural way of thinking that you can reason anything if you have a manifesto. You can reason any attitude if you have a way with words, right? And that's
Yeah,
very scary because go on.
but isn't just this how a lot of humanity just rationalizes anything in general? Because I think that this is just something you're touching on something I think that's like is very poignant as just something that's in the human condition of how we can rationalize anything, and like even if it's the most horrid, violent actions, when we show like justifications as to why we need to do this, like they can just in their own mind, even if no one has to agree with them, in their own mind they see this as the only correct way to do something. The like to commit genocide to some people is the only correct way to do it because they probably have created this ideology like a lot of the time.
Mhm. It's a reactionary way into looking into the world around you as well, because in a way it, as we were saying before, a lot of his ways in talking, he can't really come up with anything that is true to himself. He's unable to realize his true self, and he lives in this literary world, his this quotable universe in which everything can be justified, everything can be picked up from a book. And even he fails to even engage with people around him about when he tries to talk about Shakespeare, and they all talking about Shakespeare being immortal. And it's just such a, you feel the sense of like it's so surface level, the conversation, and he thinks he's the one that knows more. But as Louis was saying, like everyone in that room is probably thinking the same. They're all thinking that they are the ones that have the enlightened perspective, right?
And I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah.
Don't worry.
Don't
What
Happens
was
to
it?
the best of us.
So he mentions a lot the idea of free will. I mean, the idea of Dostoevsky in his work in general mentions a lot the idea of free will, the idea of the rational mind. What is your guys' perspective on that in relation to the book? Do you think that, I mean, I suppose, do you guys believe in free will or not? Just so we can start a conversation and maybe we can go from there.
Oh yeah, I do believe absolutely in free will. It's just that it's so easy to not like even beyond external factors in your life. If you do end up in a position of slavery, just having a slave mentality, it's so easy to be consumed by, and that's something that is understandably very difficult for some people because especially even just mundane things like always supporting someone or always like having this loyalty, this faith, have you not, of people. I do believe in faith, to believe in something like that's actually, I think of a virtue. But I think this even with people that have faith, it's so easy to completely just succumb to that as the only thing that you're thinking about rather than having a balance with everything else in your life. This is what I see as something of freedom, is ultimately being able to do a lot of things and not just having to be secluded to one side, like one corner of the room, basically.
Or
And I
your own
guess,
hole from Brad.
yeah, I was just going to say, we're sort of bound to other people, and I think the Underground Man's used his free will to carve this really bitter, lonely existence. And like, but for what worth? What purpose? What has that brought to him? So if we if we stay bound to people, is that free will because we're having to sort of accommodate people maybe and let them in and let your guard down and let certain things go? I keep saying that, let go. But yeah, is that free will, or is that just being like a slave in inverted commas to society or to a culture or to the human construct or whatever? Not sure. I'm trying to explain myself if that makes sense. Maybe.
I think this is part of the Underground Man in and of itself. It's that, isn't it? It's he treats human interaction as far away from humanism as possible. Like as you're trying to espouse there, it's okay, letting people in. How do we almost scientifically analyze that? Is it based on constructs? Is it based on like all of these tricks of the mind that he plays on himself rather than just experiencing a degree of humanism which might allow for vulnerability, which might even allow for acceptance of the unknown. And Dostoevsky talks about that a lot in his work with the idea of faith. But when he comes down to free will, it's as though he requires an answer. He can't move forward in life unless he figures out something which is completely unfalsifiable. It's as though he's putting himself up against an opponent, up and against a process of thought that he knows he will never get the answer to. But then that allows him to kind of stagnate. That allows him to reach the inevitable conclusion that it's pointless to do anyway. So that it's why all the time any action that he takes, his natural conclusion is the action that he will take will be inaction. Does anyone else have anything that they've spotted with that? Anything related to the same themes with that?
I was gonna say that what you just said just reminded me of like earlier in part one, where he casually makes mention a couple of times of like he brings up this imagery of like a wall, like punching a wall,
Yeah.
and it's like that struck me so like that very much struck me because it's like it's kind of the idea of like in some way it's like an idea of like absurdity. It's like he realizes that he cannot change the laws of nature. It was like as he said it, like he can't change the laws of nature. He can't change the fact that 2 times 2 is 4, and that there's just certain things that he can't change, and that
Yeah.
infuriates him in that way.
Yeah, but at the same time, he refuses to accept it as well, and so he takes on a futile task of punching a wall, which won't
Yeah, exactly.
it won't produce anything. All it does is allow him to sit and stagnate in this I don't even know what you would call it, in this milieu of anger and hatred. There's no logic in what he does, but he always reaches the same, in his term, logical conclusion. It is that.
There's this passage that I separated here from the book, which is related to that absolutely. The idea of breaking your head in a wall, almost like the inevitability of it, not only the metaphor of it, but the inevitability of it. It says, of course, I cannot break through the wall by battering my head against it if I really have not the strength to knock it down. But I am not going to be reconciled to it simply because it's a stone wall and I have not the strength, as though such a wall really were a consolation. Like, that is a very scary thought. And he goes on to say, I did not know how to become anything, neither spiteful nor kind, neither a rascal nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect. Now I am living out my life in my corner, taunting myself with the spiteful and useless consolation that an intelligent man cannot become anything serious, and it is only the fool who becomes anything. That is it's a very scary thought. As we were saying before, the underground man is not necessarily intelligent. He's not necessarily knowledgeable, right? I think that Dostoevsky is also, in a way, talking about the idea of experience, the idea of feeling. Because if you take into account his other works as well, a lot of his most like if you look at the Idiot, for example, or even Demons, his most reliable characters, his most honest characters, his better characters, his Christ-like characters, even if you want to say it like that, they are the ones that are not necessarily that well spoken. They are the ones that are not necessarily the ones that spouse their ideals out loud. They're the ones that get quiet, the ones that listen. And I think again, he's even reflecting in himself about himself, because we know that Dostoevsky throughout his youth, he used to go and basically stay away from people and read and read and read, and it's in essence almost in his own underground hole, right? Do you guys, in a sense, like, because everyone was saying like how much they saw themselves in a way in the underground man, but obviously because we're all here, we're not the underground man, right? We're all talking to each other, we're all communicating and creating connection. What do you think makes it that you were able to bridge that space between yourself and the world, right? And what is it that makes it that this character is not able to do it?
I mean, I said it before about how, like, I've realized, like, more now that we're having this conversation, that I don't relate to the character as much as I do the ideas. And the ideas
Mm-hmm.
themselves, they they probably are with dozens of people, and that's what ultimately I take away from, not from anything that he particularly goes through, not even his journey. Like, yeah, it's a very compelling story, but he is just, as a personality, so ordinary at the end of the day, that for me, I'm realizing, yeah, I'm not really like that like him. I've not really had that life. And I may have thoughts, like, in a surface level of, again, this idea that especially as an adult, I've grown to really resent some people that I find to be boring. Let's just be frank. Just people I find to be boring in my own eyes. But I know that for me, I'm not someone that dwells in that, because, like, even just like this week, about how I started my graduate program and I met students like in my master's program, and they're really nice, and they're people like that are very different from me, and it's like just even just in taste, of just in personality. But I found it so easy when I just allowed myself to speak to them in a normal way, like not even trying to spout out my own artistic philosophies or constantly say, "Oh, what's your favorite films?" Just talking in a way of just asking like just simple questions or just having a laugh about certain things, like because like there like I think it's that point about how like it is in a sense just trying to be unpretentious as possible, because like we can sit here and people can think at a glance that we are people that are just completely pessimistic, but if anything I've learned is, even as an adult, to just lighten up sometimes. Just like that's ultimately like the big thing is just lighten up and like don't take things super seriously to the point where you're just so morbid about things. I think that's the ultimate difference between myself and the underground man, is that I have accepted, and if anything, I try and make myself happy by like even just like with reading, because like it's funny how with many people they read like they read like this book or they watch a film like The Zone of Interest and they come out of it with like like this morbid idea of the world. But when I left the theater from that film or after I read this book, I was so happy just because of how great of an experience it was. Because I instead of just dreading or just like dwelling in like this pessimistic idea that people think about, or like these very confrontational ideas about the human psyche, I think of it as very rewarding, where I am allowing myself to just simply engage with something that moves me, like even just moved me like in emotionally and intellectually. That is just something that I try and find the positive of, which I think is what great art does, is that when if you give yourself over to it emotionally, if even just as a spectator, if you give yourself over to actually ponder on a lot of these things, I think there's a real joy in just experiencing that, even in things that are like what people think as like dark, where it's like, oh, like this piece of art, like this painting or this book or this film ruined my day. Which like yeah, with bad stuff, with stuff that is just so annoying, like yes. But when it comes to stuff that is trying to create a unique experience, like this book or anything that I love, I am happy because I get to experience like something and find the positive in how I get to use this to help with my life. Not as like it's like a life lesson, and not just having to think about oh my god, this like our world is fucked up. Because if you are like that, you're just in a bubble and you're not trying to find anything positive along with anything that's negative, which ultimately that is the failure of this man, is that he rarely thinks about something positive. And when he does think about this idea, I love the idea of beauty and the transcendental. It's like you only think of it through an idea. You're only really thinking it through just a concept rather than as an act, as a practice, as just even just really engaging with something that makes you happy, that reminds you why you are someone that appreciates life.
And allow yourself to be surprised. I think the underground man kind of is in this stasis of suffering, but it's just enough for him to bear, to prove himself right, to feed his ego in a way. Whereas for me, I think I got to a point where, I have been in a position where I've been angry at the world, at people, I'm better than people, judging them, and then thinking I know right, I know how I work, I know how the world works, but getting to a point where I got so disconnected and isolated and to a point of despair that coming back to that, pulling myself out of that and just being surprised in the simplest kindness of another person was so enlightening and beautiful that that's what made me just have a fight for life again. And I don't think the underground man will ever get to that point of despair, because he's just keeping himself in this little cocoon, I think.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
I
This
feel like what separates us from the underground man is that we still see the possibilities in other people, whereas or a possibility to learn more. I feel like we're all here to kind of learn more about this book, but the underground man I would hate to see him in a book club setting. I don't think he'd do too well because he would simply think, I don't need these other people. I know what the book's about. It's, I know what this means. I don't need, and I am right. I don't need your opinion. Whereas I feel like that's what separates us from him is like we're all here to kind of discuss and learn from one another.
Yeah.
But I, he thinks he's learned everything he can from other people, which is simply not true considering, uh, what Lisa does by the end of it by being so kind of compassionate towards them. But yeah, even then he feels like he doesn't need other people because he feels like he can't, get anything from them.
yeah. So here's the thing. This year been very rough for me. There has been times like I actually became the underground man. I just did not want to go out or interact with anyone. Yo, who's laughing out there?
is
Esteban.
put on
Yo,
spot.
man. Not three other people. Anyway, but yeah, I've been like, yeah, being really, really down and out this year, just because having difficulty finding a job, having difficulty just putting my music out there. But but like I had like the luck of having my family just supporting me through these times, and like I'm already like changing for the better, being more interactive with the world, and that's like as Brad was saying, I don't think he's, or at least that's my interpretation. I don't think he's really being down and out. In if he really was, he would have become like Lisa's lover or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he was a lot out of the house. He was trying to catch the officer and bump the shoulders. He was spending days just there working, trying to bump this officer.
Yeah.
He should have gotten his ass kicked. That would have changed him.
I mean, that's the thing. He has time to do all of these things. I think I always thought it was interesting the fact that he just mentions like almost like past the halfway point. Oh, by the way, his servant who he's not paying, and then he's able to go out and the first thing that they all talk about is how much champagne that they're going to get. I think that's a little nod by Dostoevsky as to the type of person this is, because an actual down and out person, an actual working class person, or an actual poor person, they don't have the luxury to be as full of angst as the underground man is. And it's funny because when we were speaking earlier, when Jay mentioned and Esteban said also about this idea of knowledge and whatnot, and Esteban said that it was more about experience. I think that's a bit of a fallacy from the perspective of the underground man, because we're talking about his experience, but as we've seen through everything that he tells, we don't know if he's reliable at all. Any experience that he has, he talks about being hit at school and whatnot. Everything. I'm inclined to believe that there is nothing that the underground man says that is real. I don't think that anything that comes out of his mouth is factual. He talks about the waiter delivering stuff at their table and how he purposefully ignored them, how people look at them in a certain way. I think that it's a telltale sign from Dostoevsky as the type of person that it is, and I think what George says as well is true. I don't think that he is a legitimate down and out person. I think he's a person that revels in the idea of being a victim.
I agree because he also goes on. We hear a lot of his innermost fantasies. He kind of tells us a lot about like, you know, the fantasy of him going to prison and then coming back 20 years later to like shoot the man that had sent him to prison. And it sounds very bizarrely enough like the book we are reading, one of his kind of fantasies. So I do think that everything is suspect within that. But talking about not being a down and out person, it just as a small little aside, talking about kind of him and his wealth and him refusing to pay his servant. I think it's a very telling fact that here we have a man kind of devoid of so many things. And Luiza made the comment that Dostoevsky was Greek Orthodox, and the servant reads the Psalms out loud. I don't know. I feel like there's really something to that, because there's not a lot of overt biblical kind of, at least not that I could see. I wonder if anybody else saw any, but not too many overtly biblical stuff outside of that passage where he's talking about the his waiter reading Psalm.
But in the end of the book, in the last sentence of the book, he says, I don't want to write from the dark cellar anymore, right? Or something along the lines. I'm paraphrasing it poorly, sorry, but something about the dark cellar. And it ends with like a ellipsis. And then Dostoevsky makes a little note saying, like, this is not the last thing we're going to hear from the memoirs of this paradoxical fellow, something like that. So what do you guys think? Because in the end, I mean, he does break down and cries, and I think there's a semblance of humanity into him. I still believe that if he had indeed encountered violence as he should have, it would have been more of a wake-up call to his rational mind, I suppose. But in a way, he leaves that as a nod that he didn't change, that he's still a paradoxical person, that he's still going to become and continue this loop. And I don't know, for me, we were all talking about like, go on, Adam, Brad.
I just wondered if it was like an extension to the reader to say, do you want to be this person? Is, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I also think that what you said earlier about gratitude was also something that I thought, like at that point, I also think is a nod not only to what the character is, but to the reader. Like, and I think Dostoevsky does that in a very delicate way, because you could just say like, is the moral of the story kind of way, like, but he does it in a very. He doesn't push you in it. He just shows you things, and he shows you that character and what becomes of him, and it lets your imagination flow and see, oh, whatever comes next into his life. But at the same time, I never felt that I wanted to completely isolate myself to the point of a character like the Underground Man. But what I do think that made me go out into the world more, and I'm talking about when I was younger, right? I'm talking about now, was this idea of really, really stop thinking about myself. And I know a lot of the times when we think about ourselves, we think everyone's thinking the same about ourselves, the way we see ourselves, the way we project, right? Like he does with Lisa when he thinks that she looked at him with because something is in his face, or why not? And realizing that all those things were in my own mind. But if I had read it seriously, like I'm doing it now, that I would have made that my life, because I didn't had the emotional equipment to be able to separate my vision, my thoughts from the world, from my actions and my feelings of the world. And I would have made that my whole life, right? And what would have become of me? I always think of that. And it's a very scary thought. So the ellipsis at the end, I think it's a bit of that. It's a bit of a nod to the reader.
Yeah, I agree. And I also relate a lot, because we mentioned it like an hour ago. We were talking an hour ago about how we got out of the underground man mentality or path of life. And I think for me, it was just a bit of luck, a bit of early age drinking, and the way of like, oh, you just drink a bit and then you tolerate people more, and you get out and you're like, oh, it actually doesn't matter. And it's okay to be embarrassed. It's okay to not suffer, but put yourself out. And when you say something stupid, people don't over exaggerate. They just laugh and that's it. And it turns out it's not that bad. And little experiences like this might have got me out, because I know a lot of friends who are still underground men. Like I'm in my late 20s and I have a lot of friends who are pretty much in the underground man mentality of, I'm just watching whatever YouTube videos and they confirm my world belief, and I hate people and I'm not getting out of apartment. Especially now with like the war in Ukraine, I have a lot of people who are stuck in the houses, and it's quite scary because all they do is just consume YouTube and their own beliefs and they don't get out. And it could have been me. So God bless alcohol and luck for that. But I think mostly it was just acting and doing stuff that helped me out, just in the youth. And then I wanted to say something else, what you said at the end, but I forgot.
Yeah, I think what helped me or not fall into this the underground man mentality is that I always like keep myself busy. I always have like a lot of projects going on, like not even like art projects stuff. You know what I mean? Like I like sometimes work on my car. I got like lawn work
Yeah.
to do. What's it called? I was just like painting. I'm in the middle of painting a room. Like I'm not like over filling my plate. I always have something to do and look forward to. And really, the only times I like am stuck with my thoughts, I guess, is when I sit down to write. But I'm like working on a story or something like that. I journal from time to time, and I kind of just like spill things out. But I kind of find that like a little therapeutic in a
Oh
way.
yeah.
Like I'm just like get it, or a little what I use the word it's like meditative. Like I'm getting these thoughts out of my head, so I no longer have to think about it. You know what I mean? I'm like making room to like continue on with my day, and like I try to stay pretty active. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I guess I just don't try to. And also, I was way more social in my younger days, like a big group of friends and stuff like that. And I always like put myself in social situations, even though like I could be like opposed to it at times, like you know what I mean, like oh I think Lewis and Luiza put talk about this on the podcast a lot, like how you feel like you can meet people halfway on their interests and stuff like that,
Yeah.
but when you try to like do your own, like people are just like okay, that's cool or whatever. I do find myself in that situation a lot, you know what I mean, and I guess what also helps is that I've had a long-term relationship like with my now wife. So I've never really like been alone.
Yeah.
So and even when I found myself in like low points in my life, I always had someone there. And that I would say she's way more optimistic and she's like very busy as well. So we kind of like keep ourselves going. And I guess the whole saying is like put yourself around people that that have a more positive mindset, goal oriented. Like I had to drop like I almost talked to none of my friends from high school anymore. Like we all just like fell out because they weren't like I used to like I found that me and my friends growing up, we just drank and smoked a lot of weed, did a lot of drugs, and that was basically what kept us together. You know what I mean? Once I stopped doing a lot of those things, it's just like it was funny how like I didn't connect with a lot of them
Mm.
anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's kind of sad. Like I would like to like talk to him again, but I don't know. It's just and also because I moved away pretty young. When I was like 19, created a new group of friends, and then I finally moved back to my hometown, and I'm just like I don't know. It was like I guess it was just I felt no reason to
I
like
think this is a pretty common thing for a lot of people in here. I think a lot of people have gone through something similar, like seeing friends that kind of stagnated. I mean, I I probably also, like Jay mentioned, he said, like, know a few people that are the underground man. I do think that it's applicable. And I think that one of the common things that you hear from a lot of people in here on the Discord or the Patreon or whatever, a lot of people have, they seem to have some affinity with some of the things that we've mentioned on the podcast and
Mhm.
whatnot, of just moving forward, of, the struggle of associating. But I find that if you are struggling with that level of association or connecting with people, it just takes a second just to analyze. Okay, am I feeling lonely because I'm moving forward with things and I'm bettering myself and I'm gaining self-esteem, but at the same time I'm still willing to be ultimately a good person, which is
Mhm.
something that the underground man isn't. He is okay with his stagnation. He's okay at wallowing in something, and at the same time, he is still more than anyone else. He is craving for some connection, but yeah. I don't think that. I think what you say ultimately, a lot of people would look at that in a sad light of, oh, moving away from friends and everything. But as you said, you have a wife and you see your friends that have just essentially remained in the same spot. And Jay also said, late 20s, you see people that you can have bad traits when you're 18, but time passes very quickly, and before you know it, like, you're hitting those landmarks in age. You think, oh, I'm the same as I was 10 years ago, and that's a very dangerous spot to be in.
Can I just mention about gratitude as well? Just going back to that, because he mentions about ingratitude a few times and how that's what human beings suffer from. And I don't think he could ever understand what gratitude is, just because he wants everything around him has to have a use or a purpose, and he needs to either somebody has to make him feel a certain way for him to, prove himself right, or he has to use it to judge somebody on his preconceptions. But with gratitude, it's about something just a lot of the time just in between. It's just a feeling you don't necessarily do something with. You just can feel it and accept it, or maybe share it with another person. Share that gratitude with happiness, or with something reciprocal. And that's something he will never be able to understand or implement in his life.
Do you know what I also think that is? I think because gratitude is also a level of vulnerability. You have to willingly accept to put yourself in a situation where you are accepting something from someone, whether it's help or advice or anything. And he chooses to put himself in positions where he's not accepting things. He just chooses to put himself in lowly positions where he's able to look at people with disdain. I think the metaphor of him being in a dark cellar at the bottom of the world, I think that's a really distinct choice from Dostoevsky, in that this is someone who has both figuratively and physically removed themselves from the world and chose to place themselves at the pit of it. And when you see things like that, it is almost as if you're choosing to view yourself almost as like otherworldly to people. You're choosing to see yourself as almost like a wretch-like creature, in which case gratitude is never going to occur, because people are innately doing things against you. Why would people not even go out of their way to help someone as worthless as you? Everyone in the world should be looking towards him with their hand outstretched, and they're not doing that. So in his eyes, they're the ones that should be going out of their way for him, when the reality is, like you said, it's reasons like that he's never able to experience any kind of gratitude, because he's built this giant separation between him and other people, that even the basic things he won't be able to reciprocate.
And the symbol of that as well. Go on, Brad. It's okay.
Yeah, I was just quickly going to say, like, I read about the interpretation of the word either underground or cellar can be defined as like a crawl space under a house, which symbolically is even like, underneath the house where there should be comfort and love and family. And he's, just in the dusty, cobweb, dirty space underneath that, which is just really unpleasant to think about.
Yeah, and even the idea of like he sees himself as enlightened, but he puts himself in the darkest corner, right? In the place that you cannot see the light at all. He imagines the light. He imagines he can see it clearly. I really like that.
I also want to add another thing. I think from the actual the diegetic space of the world, of what the notes from the underground are. I mean, what is the purpose of the writings? Because Dostoevsky says that these are his memoirs. So are we to also believe then that in the reality of this universe, he is actually writing all this down? And if that is the case, who's he writing it for?
Especially if he despises everyone, right?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of it?
In the reality of this world, what are the notes from the underground? What is he supposed to be doing with them? What's the purpose of them existing?
Yeah.
Could I add something on the naming, and then we can continue? Because while we're here, it also means something like anti-government organization, like something run in the shadow, or something run in conspiracy. And also, like, it's like underground structure. It could be underground, or it could be kind of between the 0 and first floor. So it has different meanings and different things as well. And it's pretty good.
Yeah, I also thought
I
that,
was-
I also
Go
thought
on,
that,
Tom.
Okay, Tom can go.
All right. Yeah, all right. I was just going to say that to Lewis's question, doesn't he at one point admit that his diary is for nobody but himself? Doesn't he say, like, you, as in you, even though I know you will never read this? Probably horribly paraphrasing, but isn't there a part in the book where he admits that nobody else will be reading this and that he's writing it really only for himself? And so it seems like the notes from Underground might just be for his own personal vanity because he's bored.
I
That's
think
true,
it's,
but he also lied.
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the interesting part in that is that he spends so much time of it envisioning the person reading it. It seems as though, you know, I still don't believe anything that he says, even to that point where no one's meant to read it. I think it's his very intention for someone to read it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like, the interesting part about that immediately struck me is how he references us, like the reader, or just of the supposed audiences, with gentlemen, which I want to know what people think about that, just why he specifically uses that word in particular, because I remember, you know, when I was reading it, it got a whole new different meaning to it once I was reading part two and actually knew that character. Because like when it was just gentleman in the sense of part one of not even knowing like specifics about this character, I thought that again it could be seen, you know, as class consciousness, but also just the idea of this mannered type of civilization and the contradictions that come with even calling yourself a gentleman in a reality that is very abrasive, because it undeniably a lot of places in the world are like, yeah, that's a question I've actually been wanting to ask. Like, what do you guys take away from just him using the word gentleman to describe this supposed reader or readers?
Yeah.
I remember thinking about it actually when I was reading and thinking, you know, is it like an academic sort of gentleman or like a class thing, like you say? Because I guess women wouldn't come into it because they, back then, I guess they wouldn't be scholarly in any way. But yeah, it is interesting. But also, I have to leave now as well. This has been absolutely incredible. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was nice to finally speak to you, Brad.
Yeah, nice to meet
You
you.
too.
See you
Take
next
care.
time, hopefully.
All right, take
Yeah,
care.
you will. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I saw Bryan, you unmuted your mic at one point, so did you want to say something?
Yeah, I forgot though. It'll probably come back to me.
Okay. Yeah, I do think it's an interesting thing, and I do think it changes the perspective as you actually go through the book. Because at the beginning, what I initially think when reading it is, I just think it's almost just a characterization, because I think that he wants to associate himself kind of this ilk of society that is slightly bourgeois. He does have a bit of a superiority complex in the way that he views himself, and so I also imagined him at the beginning as, you know, he only converses with high society. That's how I view it at the beginning. But then as it goes on, part of me is inclined to think that all of the things that he projects on the reader who keeps laughing at him and whatnot, I'm also inclined to believe that he's envisioning the crew of his quote friends from the dinner. That's how I imagine it.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't thought that at all, actually. I thought it's almost like a passive aggressive way, but also in the fact that if you must be reading something by him, you must be a gentleman. You must be of a superior ilk of society in a way, intellectually or financially. I don't know. I thought about that.
Because they're the only people that could even understand him.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly how I thought about it.
I actually was going to chime in and say that did cross my mind in like part two when I was reading that he was addressing like the group of people at the dinner or whatever. I think it could be considered like a double meaning there.
Yeah,
I think that could be fair to say, probably.
Yeah, I think that's his nature. I think he's very much one of those characters where you can never fully understand what he means, and everything that he says he doesn't mean, and everything that he doesn't say is what he truly means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just
Do
thinking.
you think you could help
I'll
do
leave
you
everyone
think
to
you can help?
ponder on that.
Okay, I thought I could sneak in a question. Do you think you could
Yeah.
help
Yeah,
an
go.
underground man? Do you think you could, if like you met them in person, or you maybe you know somebody and you could help them, something you could say or do, or
Do you know
encourage them to
what?
do, or you think it's not possible? Because I think it's not possible.
I would have to be as ignorant and as self-absorbed as the underground man himself if I think that I could help him.
But then you wouldn't
Okay,
be
I
able to
agree.
help.
Yeah,
Okay, I think I
Yes,
agree. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's an impossibility, and this is actually I still don't know what the general consensus is, but this is why I think that he is irredeemable. All of the things that we've mentioned about him is that he has the solutions to him. Well, that's why I think he has all the answers. He knows what to do, but the action that he takes is an action where he will inevitably lead to a conclusion that is completely fatalist. That's why I don't think he's redeemable. I don't think he's helpable at all. I feel nothing but pity and anger towards him. And I think Tom said it at the beginning. I feel the same sentiments. I do not like him, and reading through Notes from the Underground is I obviously I enjoy it, but it is such a it's so tiresome to be in the presence of someone that is so grandiose in the vision of themselves and so incapable. And
Yeah.
and it's ironic that we sit here trying to dissect him when the only reason that we're trying to dissect him is because we get a glimpse into how fractured and fragmented his mind is. When if we actually see him outside of his mind through the eyes of other people, through the eyes of the friends that are there, through the eyes of Lisa, we would just see a completely inept human being.
Well, Dostoevsky actually makes a note to that. In the beginning, he says that the first part is his ideas, and the second part, we shall reproduce this person's notes proper, dealing with certain events of his life, meaning like not in the way he sees it, but in the way he actually is, right? Like,
But also, you mentioned that see them as inept, but we also see them inept only in these two situations. All the other times, they see them as a normal person, as somebody just whatever going through life.
Yeah.
And I think I read it somewhere as little notes. I'm not sure. I didn't do too much research or looking into it. I think in one of the critics who was saying that in his notes, Dostoevsky was writing that this was the majority of Russian people. Like, I'm not sure, Russian middle class, majority of middle class was this underground man, and trying to say that was the majority of people.
Interesting. That sounds like a very underground man-esque perspective from Dostoevsky himself there.
So if we were to believe that the Underground Man intended for people to read this, do you think it was a cry for help, or he was looking for confirmation in his views?
I don't think he'd be willing to accept any answer from anyone. I think regardless of what he received from other people, he wouldn't accept it anyway. He would find a way for it to just confirm anything that he believed, even if it was relevant to what the person said.
Wait, are we talking about Dostoevsky or the underground man? Sorry.
The Underground.
yeah,
I was referring to the
Oh, okay.
Underground.
We are all
Okay.
the underground man inside of all of us. It lives deep inside of all of us right now.
Cool.
In all seriousness, no, I'm just thinking about how Luiza mentioned something about how like you don't want to put this with contemporary ideas in her mind, but right now I'm just thinking about, especially when Lewis was mentioning how he's a man that even if he was to give other perspectives, he would just completely ignore it. There's so many people just in high positions of power, even just of people that everyone knows. I'm just thinking, you act like a child when you are just someone that only wants to freaking just present your own ego and just sit and to go up to stand up to a conference with thousands of people that are all yes men, and so you can all just they can all just go and just say like, look at how smart I am. It's like yeah. I'm gonna bring one example of like a pseudo intellectual, like, because I remember yesterday I think it was like Chemotherapy Gordon. He was like mentioning like stuff like the 80s and stuff, and like I think someone mentioned Madonna. Like, in terms of a person, I fucking hate her. Like she's like the epitome of like a fucking pseudo intellectual. It was when like a great example of just a person thinking like she's smarter than she is. It's just thinking that just because she learned of this abstract philosophy and just way of examining life of Kabbalah and just going like, I'm gonna buy 10,000 gallons of Kabbalah water and just make a pool of it and have all my friends philosophize with me like my own little like fucking club. I'm just like thinking like, just because I know something that no one else does, because like it's like how you it's like it's like it's like Godard and how he reads one quote from a book and then like even like I remember like bring it back to Dostoevsky, he has to go in a conference and remember, okay, I have to mention Dostoevsky just once. And fuck, I'm just thinking like people, there's so many people of that nature that just the more I think about it, it just absolutely pisses me off.
Here's what I think that the Underground Man would actually be in relation to that. The Underground Man wouldn't be Godard. The Underground Man would be someone who would look at Godard, hate him, but envy him at the same time because they want to be in that position. They want to be exactly that.
Yeah,
I think that his desires are all superficial, and also he mentions it with the Crystal Palace and whatnot. He is a person that wants to bump into the officer. He wants to be, he wants to be a manly man, and at the same time, he wants to go to a dinner and quote Shakespeare and have everyone in awe of him. He wants to be with a sex worker. He wants to be a person that is perfect across the board, and it is why ultimately we both said it here, is that the one thing that I can really, really see within contemporary society with the Underground Man is the incel movement. I think it's almost a direct parallel of a kind of thinking, the kind of self-imposed victimization, as well as a superiority complex.
And the superficiality as well.
I don't know if anyone else thought that or anything like that or disagrees completely.
Like I had thoughts about that, about these like contemporary words that we come up with, which is why I just imagine all these incels that we talk about, if they actually read this book, like it would just be like any other piece of media that critiques themselves. Instead of looking at their critiques, they would look at it as a gratification of their own mindset.
That's literally me.
God, I hate when people like just like basically just support that and validate that and saying, yes, you are allowed to do this fucking joke. It's just like it's just so, I hate it so much.
I was definitely
I
was definitely thinking, talking about like the incel and then literally me. I was thinking about Taxi Driver a little bit while watching, while reading this. You know what I mean? And I think I saw a clip of Scorsese talking about Paul Schrader, and he was reading a lot of Dostoevsky at that time. I think he was saying, so I'm wondering if he got a lot of his ideas from that. Well, I know he's also a fan of Bresson, and Bresson was a fan of Dostoevsky as well.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the parallels are clearly there, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely.
That's true, but also any respectable person should be a fan of Dostoevsky. So
yes,
I totally agree.
I agree.
Yeah, that's
I used to hate.
That's what
I used to hate Dostoevsky in university. Oh, sorry.
Why?
So I was born in Ukraine, and like Russian literature was shown upon us in school, and everything I read in school I hated. And then we started with Crime and Punishment, and it was kind of stupid. I still think it's kind of stupidish. It feels to me incomplete, feels to me, doesn't matter. We can talk about it some other time. But then I reread it later by myself when I was like later in my university, and I was kind of intellectualizing myself with existential philosophy, and I got to Dostoevsky again, and I still didn't like it. And I was talking to a lot of people, and I was telling them, oh, you just like it because it's famous, because everybody likes it. You actually don't like it. And it's still true. But then I read at some point Brothers Karamazovs, because it was mentioned, because it's... So I read Crime and Punishment, and I read The Devils, and I read the Idiot, and I also kind of didn't like it. It was kind of better than Crime and Punishment for me. But then I got to Karamazov, and I'm like, I get it now. It's so good. He's like one of the best writers ever. And then I read Notes from the Underground, and I really liked it. And then it was changed because it seems like everything that he wrote before was kind of leading to Karamazov, and it's kind of one book that has most of the ideas of the previous books, and it has less of the stupid aristocracy people I don't want to read about. But it has more of the essence of Dostoevsky and essence of like people and Russian people and just people in general. And then complemented with Notes from the Underground. It's like, okay, these two books you need to read, and everything else, like, okay, if you like it, you can get some out of it, but it's not necessary.
Yeah,
I think it's quite admirable how you hated his work and yet managed to read his entire bibliography just to get to a point that you can say that you like him. I think that was very admirable.
I mean,
just everybody talks about it all the time of like, yeah, maybe I don't get it. So I was just, okay, I can try it one more time.
That reminds me of how I used to be on the side of thinking I would hate Pasolini until literally when my first job was when I was working at a small organization for, like, in my university, like they call the Poetry Center, where it's like a bunch of poets and like we have poetry readings. And my boss, like, he's a big poetry reader, and specifically he's a big fan of Pasolini, both in his films and his poetry. He's basically the sole reason as to why he, like, and subconsciously he convinced me to last year to marathon all of his films. And once I actually just sat down and tried to understand his work, and I love Pasolini, but yet I can say that there's some of his films I don't like particularly care that much about, like The Hawks and the Sparrows or Medea. I'm not too big on, but like even then, like even with his films that I don't love, I still find like his work to be so compelling when I actually try to engage with it and not just have these preconceived notions of who Pasolini was to me.
Bryan mentioned something about Paul Schrader and Taxi Driver and all that. It's interesting because Paul Schrader, he always talks about it in interviews, and you guys can find it if you want. He says that if he hasn't written something like Taxi Driver, he would have become that character. So he wrote it almost as an act of like redeeming himself and his own thoughts, like his own dark thoughts about society. So that's very interesting because when you see Paul Schrader, he seems like a very chill person, but he always dealing with these very heavy topics in his films. And to hear him talk about the idea that he wrote that script because he felt he was becoming that character and he needed almost to exercise those ideas out there, right? I can see that a little bit with Dostoevsky when he always comes back to the idea of the dreamer, that he talks about the underground man being a dreamer. In A Gentle Creature, he talks about the dreamer again. In other of his stories, he talks about the dreamer. And I think he sees himself like that, and he almost exercises this part of himself through his characters a bit. I feel like that when writing as well. A lot of it putting thoughts and ideas that I have, sometimes even from a character's mouth that has nothing to do with me. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting because Taxi Driver and a lot of even like Shinji from Evangelion, that people say that's me, is also another character that was created to also put that bad side of you all there, the alter side, and almost exercise that.
Yeah, it's funny, Luiza, like I remember last time you were here, there's a little tangent about Evangelion, because I think it relates to this a bit, because like when you were like falling asleep, when Lewis was just there alone, like I talked a bit about the rebuilds and detailing more about why I love the rebuilds, and I think like the last film, to sum it up, like why I think it proved to itself and to me why it deserved to exist, was that it showed, like Anno wanted to show that he has matured, that he has grown up and moved on from just even what his mindset that he felt in like the original series and in the Evangelion. It's a very poignant ending in that way of, it's Shinji. It's because it's very much so. It's a therapeutic process where it's a story of Shinji having to to confront his flaws, mainly through like Gendo, and even Gendo gets this sort of redemptive arc to really examine who he is as a person, which was like very fascinating and very compelling. And by the end, Shinji, let's say without spoiling it, like Shinji grows up and it's shown that he has moved on and had and very much so, Shinji can be a sort of a a stand-in for Ano, in the sense that he has matured, that he has not dwelled in this idea of just being this pessimistic, because in the last film, Shinji is borderline suicidal, and he thinks that everything in his life is just complete, there's no worth in helping anyone. And ultimately that's the redemptive quality, is that he confronts that and he learns to find happiness and beauty within that, which to bring it back to Dostoevsky, I think it is that redemptive quality, and how I think Dostoevsky wrote like how Paul Schrader wrote Taxi Driver, or why Ono made The Rebuilds. Dostoevsky, I think, is someone that probably wrote this so that it is something where it is a life lesson for him. It is something to help him mature as a person, to not just dwell in his own nihilism.
I think that's a good way to tie everything together. We could sit and chat about this for many, many more hours, but I think what we can try and do is try and wrap things up here. So if anyone else has anything interesting that they want to raise, any other points that they want to raise about the book, any talking points, just feel free to get them out now. If you want to start another topic of conversation, if you want to just raise anything, by all means.
Quick one, suggestion. We already talked about this before. Esteban mentioned Albert Camus, and I think The Fall is really good complementary read to this one. It also talks about person, talks about their values, and when the values get challenged, the person just crumbles, and I think it's really good as well.
We can probably pop that in the vote, I think, for the next one.
Let's do that.
Yeah, just one quick general comment was, I was just gonna say, throughout the book, I was just so enamored with how prophetic Dostoevsky was. He just predicted Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus and inceldom, I guess, for lack of a better term. But he was just so, I just admired so much how keen of an observer he was, and how he accurately predicted some of the main tenets of modernist philosophy, and how he was able to basically predict it, and not only have a prediction for that, but also have a response to it.
Yeah, very insightful. And I mean, if you could only see post-structuralism, he would have been shocked even more. I think it's also that there's a book I really want to read, which is called something along the lines of Dostoevsky read Hegel and then wept, or something like that, and is a bit of the 19th century materialistic and the transcendental wave at the same time, kind of in conflict. Guys, really enjoyed this conversation. I know we could talk about this forever. I'm going to open the vote for us for the next month. Hopefully we can pull Albert Camus, we can pull Blood Meridian, and we can pull more books. Maybe if you guys have some ideas, just write it down on the literature board, and I'll kind of compile bits and we can kind of go from there. Yeah, it feels like weird to close it because the conversation has been so good.
I mean,
but I just want to say bye to you guys.
It's like the book version of the deep dive, where we could just talk about it for hours. I almost was gonna make a joke, just going just trying to do an intro, going "Welcome to Book Club," a series where we look at literature's greatest masterpiece or something like that.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. We appreciate you spending all this time with us. We enjoyed it as well. We hope that we can do this again, and we'll be dropping in as well on the Hangouts or some other stuff as well soon anyway. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah, I really
it's super fun to talk to everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a good one.
Cheers, guys. Cheers. Take
Have a
care.
good one.
Yes.
Take care.
See ya.
Everybody.